their guns to the woods and shooting at targets at, doing something that's perfectly legal for someone to do. And, they recorded themselves firing at targets and, in their excitement, they're yelling Allahu Akbar. And they had a video that they wanted converted to a DVD, and they brought it to a local store to have that done. And the store clerk sees this video, sees a bunch of Muslim guys firing guns and yelling Allahu Akbar, and says, well, this must be something suspicious, and calls up the FBI. And the FBI then worked for months using two informants. One was a convicted fraud artist. The other was awaiting a murder charge, and he was to be deported to Albania. And I say that not to just belittle these two informants, but to make the point that often the informants who work these cases are usually criminals themselves, and often pretty distasteful criminals. And they basically built a conspiracy around the idea that they were going to attack the Fort Dix Army base, even though the conspiracy was entirely talk, and only one of the 5 defendants really ever talked about it. The other 4 were just kind of orbiting the plot, and yet they were ultimately convicted. Kind of tellingly, the U.S. attorney who convicted them in New Jersey was Chris Christie, now the governor and the Republican presidential candidate. And I don't know if you watched the first Republican presidential debate. One of the things that Christie, said when he was debating Rand Paul about warrantless surveillance and the need to catch terrorists is like, look, I've done this. I've convicted terrorists. And, an interesting footnote that I would offer is that when he says that, he's talking about the Fort Dix 5 case, which is it's a really dubious case, and, probably not something, it is not the type of terrorism that I think is worth kind of bragging about in that sense. I mean, he didn't really capture anyone who was dangerous before the government got involved.
Yeah, the other guys on the stage are probably more dangerous than these guys he busted. Oh.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a theme in a lot of these cases, and I think a great question. Which, what the FBI says is like, you can't catch the devil with choir boys, right? So you have to use bad guys to catch bad guys. But the problem in these sting cases is often, the bad guys you're using to catch other bad guys are the worst bad guys. There are examples of, the guy in the Newburgh 4 case, the informant, was actually wanted in Pakistan for murder charges and had fled Pakistan on murder charges, and yet this is a guy who's setting up 4 guys in a sting operation whose worst crimes were like lowly drug offenses. So there really is kind of a disproportionate criminality that occurs when you look at the informants and the targets that they ultimately get in these sting operations.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because normally when you have an informant in a case, it's usually it's like a drug case, right? They'll bust the guy with a little bit of drugs. And then I'll say, okay, fine. Well, give us 3 cases. We'll let you off this case here, and we'll even put you to work. You can go to work, you can make a little money on the side. You send us a bunch of cases. Now, is that how are they getting these informants in these cases? How are they finding them?
In some ways, it's the same way, except it's got a little bit different twist because, in a drug case, just about anyone could fit in as someone who might be interested in buying or selling drugs, right? Yeah. You or I could be the buyer or seller of drugs. So if we got busted, we could probably work with the FBI as an informant in some way if that's something we wanted to do. In terrorism cases, it's a lot harder because you and I probably couldn't do that because we don't look the part, we don't speak the language, we don't understand the religion as well as if we were, if we worshipped Islam. And so as a result, the FBI has a very small pool of people that they can use in these type of sting operations. And so what we see, when we look at the informants is that oftentimes they will be hung up for some charge. A man named Shahed Hussein was the informant in the Newburgh 4 case, and he's the one I mentioned who was fleeing Pakistan on murder charges. He came to the FBI's attention because he was working with other people to run this scam out of the Albany DMV where he would help immigrants get their driver's licenses. They were illegal immigrants. He would help them get their driver's licenses illegally so that they could be taxi cab drivers in New York City. And when they busted him for that, they then get him to flip on his co-conspirators, and they realize like, hey, this is a guy from Pakistan who speaks 4 languages, kind of understands the culture, understands that part of the world, and they assigned him at that point, after he worked off his charge on the fraud case, they assigned him a terrorism case, and they ended up paying him money, and they were so pleased with that that case that they've since moved him to several different terrorism cases, and he's now making, according to court records, at least six figures for every case that he works. So this is an example of the FBI finding the informant because he's a criminal himself, but then offering him essentially a career change to say, okay, now you can work with us full time as an informant, and that's a testament really to the fact that the FBI is so desperate for people who look the terrorist part, so to speak, and are comfortable, doing the work that needs to be done in an undercover sting operation. And so when they find some of these people, they move them from case to case, and it's not uncommon now to see the same informants pop up in all of these cases because basically the FBI is shipping them around the country, to work various cases.
So you're saying that these guys are getting $100,000 for every case they set up?
Yeah, there are a couple of instances where the informants have gotten more than $400,000, but there's a huge financial motivation for informants to find terrorists. So, what ends up happening is the FBI tells them, look, you could make this much money if you find us a target of a sting operation, and the kind of telling of how enormous these kind of incentives are. Shahed Hussein, the guy in the Newburgh case, before he met the defendants that he ultimately targeted in the Newburgh case, he spent 11 months in the mosque in Newburgh, New York. In fact, he went to one mosque so frequently that they invited him to join the board of directors. And the only reason he was going to the mosque was he was looking for someone he could build a case around, because he knows that if you find someone you can build a case around, you can make six figures or more. And so, there are a lot of questions about whether these huge incentives have kind of helped pervert the way the FBI works these cases, because, the informant isn't looking out for God and country, isn't looking to save America. The informant is looking to make a big payday. And so he when he's looking for ways of building a case around someone, he's looking for the ones he can build a case around so he can get paid, not so much so he can keep, you and I and the rest of the United States safe.
Yeah, and if once you get that good at it, once you're that good at setting these guys up, then you're right. You're looking for guys with mental illness that you can manipulate and have them there in the jackpot there.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I mentioned that in the Newburgh case. I mean, what was so kind of amusing, I thought, was James Cromedy, the lead defendant. He and Shahed Hussein, the informant, spent weeks and weeks talking, and Shahed Hussein's cover was that he was an operative for Jaish-e-Mohammed, or JEM, which is among the better known terrorist organizations out there, I guess you could say. And so you think someone who's interested in getting involved in terrorism or is interested in Muslim extremists, they would know who JEM is. And yet when Jaish-e-Mohammed, or excuse me, when Shahed Hussein tells James Cromedy, "Hey, I'm with Jaish-e-Mohammed," James Cromedy's reaction is like, "What? What's that? Are you guys Muslim?" And it just shows like how easily manipulated many of these defendants are, and how they lack a lot of sophistication. And in fact, too, a lot of the defendants, many of the defendants are particularly egregious in their kind of mental illness. There have been at least two cases where the defendant had schizoaffective disorder, which means he had trouble distinguishing between reality and fantasy. And so you can imagine, for a strong-willed informant who's expecting to make tens of thousands of dollars if you can build a case around someone, it's not going to be very difficult to manipulate someone who has trouble distinguishing fantasy from reality and dream from from waking, and that's what's happened in several of these cases.
Now, wouldn't it seem too that if you have a small number of these informants setting up these cases, that after the first couple of trials, they would become known to actual foreign intelligence agencies that are sending over operatives here to this country?
So it's a two-part question. So one of the things I would say is, like, that's been the government's claim in protecting the identity of these informants, and what they will say is, well, there have been several examples, including the one that I can think of now is a case out of Houston involving a man named Barry Bujol, where they had the informant testify under disguise. So he had like a black screen in front of him, so his face wasn't shown when he testified. And their reason for that was to say, well, look, if any real terrorist out there saw him, his life would be in danger. The irony of that is that in the plot, there were no real terrorists involved. I mean, the plot, the only terrorists involved were the FBI agents and informants posing as terrorists, and so there really wasn't anyone as part of the plot who would otherwise want to harm that person. And then the other interesting part of that is that the irony is that the FBI normally, when an informant is exposed, wouldn't be able to use him again. I mean, there are many examples of, for example, what the FBI's use of informants in mafia cases. When they have to reveal the identity of a mafia guy as an informant, it's very unlikely that he's ever going to work as an informant again, because all of the mafiosi know that this guy was a rat, and so they're not going to trust him. He could never work again. The cases involving counterterrorism stings are much different, and in fact what you've seen is that the FBI has continued to use informants who have testified because they know that there really isn't any kind of nexus among these people like there would be with the mafia, that these people can move around from place to place. One of the ironies kind of related to this, and it's shown in a really great documentary that I would recommend everyone watch, and it's getting its national release this week, I believe. It's called Terror, and it has the T in parentheses as if error, but it documents this sting as it unfolds, and it documents what happened in this incident that I was tangentially related to, which was Shahed Hussein, who was the man I mentioned from Pakistan who worked the Newburgh 4 case. He was involved in a case in Pittsburgh where the target of the sting became very suspicious that he was an informant, and Shahed Hussein gave the target his business card, and so the target of the sting, the defendant, a man named Khalifa al-Akili, goes home and does what you or I probably would do, which is to Google his phone number and figure out who this guy is. And the FBI in the Newburgh 4 case had released a number of transcripts as part of the trial, and some of those transcripts were cell phone conversations between the informant Shahed Hussein and the targets, and at the top of those transcripts was the cell phone number. And I, as part of my reporting, had put a lot of those documents online, and so when Khalifa al-Akili Googles this phone number, he comes across this FBI document that identifies the man as an informant, and the case was blown. And so, what's ended up happening a little bit, and I know this is anecdotal, but it's kind of telling that there is a certain Keystone Cops element to the way the informants are being used, and something as simple as protecting the identity of the informant from case to case just by changing his phone number is something that, for whatever reason, the FBI has failed to do.
Well, obviously, yeah, because the informant is not too concerned about the people he's targeting having the brains to know.
Right, that's one way to look at it too, right? Like they have no, their assessment of the target is that he's not going to be able to find this out, so maybe that's why they don't bother to change it.
Yeah, he's got a meeting with his stockbroker, his accountant, and he's got important phone calls coming in on his investments and his portfolio. That is unbelievable. Well, it just goes to show you that the informant himself is not concerned about these people.
Right. I mean, I think for sometimes informants, and I think there's some truth to this, the idea that the informants are referred to as sociopaths, and to be a good informant, you have to have a certain amount of sociopathic tendencies. And by that I mean, to be a good informant, you have to be able to develop really strong relationships and friendships with people over months, months, sometimes years. And then you have to be able to one night turn on them and end those friendships and testify against them and send this person to jail for decades, right? And it's a type of betrayal that I don't think most people are capable of, and is certainly kind of sociopathic tendency for those who can do that. And certainly, I think for informants like Shahed Hussein, they're capable of doing this. At the same time, they view this as their job. This is how they make money. You find them, you bust them, and you can make hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's why these informants continue to work case after case, because they know they can make so much money. And at the same time, there is a certain flippancy to it. I mean, I think if you could ever get them to talk candidly about it, they would admit that, they don't feel their lives are in danger, because the targets of their sting operations are almost always people whose, deadliest weapon is a kitchen knife, right? These aren't people who are going to necessarily be able to enact any sort of revenge or are kind of capable of significant violence on their own.
Yeah, that's true. And they would have to know also, too, that the people they're targeting don't have an organization behind them that